Hi, everybody. My name is Tuhin Verma, and we're going to be talking a little bit about how to drive engagement in the e-commerce world. E-commerce has boomed, especially after the whole COVID-19 situation, with folks really using more and more, purchasing more and more online. So what I'm going to talk about today is a PM's perspective of how to drive engagement with so many different competitors out there. How do you differentiate your product? How do you drive users to use your particular product more and more, enjoy using it, and giving you some amount of strategies on leveraging intelligent models here. Right? So that's the objective of our presentation. So just a little bit about me, why I'm here talking about this. I am currently a senior PM at eBay. I'm very focused on the buyer experience side of things and engagement, driving engagement on the platform. I've been with them for a few years. But before that, I was actually a founder of a small startup called DriveAssist. And what we were hoping to do is just make the world a safer place by making sure users, typically who use their phones while they're driving, are just doing it in a safe manner and basically a safe and intuitive manner, reducing the number of crashes that happen because of this. Right. In my spare time, I love to aero model, build scale models of airplanes, and then a little bit of running. So this is just me at the San Francisco Marathon a couple of years ago. Pretty unshaven here, but basically this was super interesting. But I ran the marathon in San Francisco and at Berkeley later that year. So just a little bit about me. So what this webinar is and isn't, right? So basically what we're going to try and do here is identify opportunities to impact user behavior, right? Influence them effectively to increase engagement and really try and differentiate yourself from so many others out there, right? And we'll talk about a little bit about how do you use machine learning as a lever for that, right? But this is definitely not a technical discussion. I think there are plenty of those on the internet. Coursera and so many others offer so many different ways in which you understand how these models work, how to capture that data and create output. But this is not a technical discussion, right? So I'm hoping as a PM that you not go too deep into it. It's definitely helpful to have an understanding, but I'm not going to cover a lot of that here. The most important aspect of engagement is really whenever you're using these models to align them with your strategy, right? And what I mean by that is each individual product strategy should be clearly defined before you're really coming in and leveraging these models, right? Or leveraging input and user behavior. Right? So I think it's extremely important nowadays when I hear people, product managers specifically, starting to consider these models. It's permeating across the product board. Right? What I mean by that is you've got a small product that customers are super familiar with, and you still go in and try and build a model around it. While it'd be a great model, the effectiveness of that model typically is questionable. And so the way I would like to think about this is on a two by two matrix. Right? On the left-hand side, you have customer familiarity. How familiar is the customer with your product? Right? And e-commerce, as it has kind of grown over the years, people have become more and more familiar with how to buy online. Right? What your value proposition is, how your product works. They're very familiar. But there is also, because of the amount of time that's passed, product complexity has also increased. As products try and evolve to try and drive more personalization, drive more content, you've got larger organizations contributing to each single product, you actually increase product complexity. And so where these models really, truly make sense are where you're your customer is not as familiar with your product, right? And your product complexity is high, right? Um, it's important to recognize what I mean by product here, right? Product here could be anything as simple as shipping as a module, right? That could be your product, as opposed to, say, for example, your homepage, which is also a product. So it's dependent on how you define product in this scenario. So again, take what I'm saying within the scope of what you're working on. But typically, this is a good rule of thumb to try and identify when you're going to implement some of these use cases, some of these models. So let's talk first about customer familiarity a little bit, right? So I mean, it's a no-brainer, but familiarity is obviously a function of time and with engagement with your product, right? So over time, the users, as they get more and more, use more and more of your product, they'll get familiar with what it does and what it doesn't. The trick, however, is that each user has to be segmented effectively. And so the way I like to segment users is on the left-hand side, you have new users who are still looking to kind of sign up, right? And that spectrum goes all the way to the right, where users have formed the habit with your product, right? And what you want to do with your engagement models is basically make sure users or your cohorts are moving very, very quickly between these individual frames, right? So if you've got a lot of users stagnant within this whole in after sign up, for example, and not moving the setup, that's where you need to focus. And how you focus on them is that your models should have metrics that basically are suitable for that particular cohort. So just to give you guys an example, there are two kinds of metrics that you truly. One are input metrics, and the other are, and you could decide to optimize for either one, right? So, for example, if would consider page as the product that you're trying to optimize, potentially an input metric is just the user clicking sign up, as opposed to an output metric would be the user actually completing a sign up, right? And so whenever you consider your models, make sure that the drivers and the value of your model is effectively moving the metric that you're really interested in. And later on in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about strategies that different companies have used to try and drive users through this journey. The second one is product complexity. So I've taken a very broad look at the competitive landscape that we have here on e-commerce, right? And I think this is up for debate because obviously, if you're working at Etsy or Wish, you think that your product's super simple, as opposed to somebody, as opposed to Williams. So I apologize in advance for anybody who thinks that this may be incorrect. But this is just my perspective. Right. And the reason I've put some of these marketplaces on the right-hand side is that you have the added complexity of understanding a third party, as opposed to, say, Williams-Sonoma, which basically carries its own inventory, and all you're really looking at is how effective Williams-Sonoma's items are for you. Amazon, Walmart, obviously trying to move a little bit to the right. If your product complexity is still relatively lower than you would have on the other side. But again, just like customer familiarity, you base yourself very realistically within sort of this this variation or this this spectrum of e-commerce players who you're playing or competing, right? And so when you mix both of those together, right, some familiarity portions and the product complexity portions, you can go back to that 2x2 I showed you earlier, and decide where you want to use machine learning and where you want to leverage multiple components to generate a successful outcome. So now let's go through the journey now, right? I talked about those 4 steps in the journey, right? So setup, signed up, wow moments, and then habit forming, right? And so I'll try and give you a few examples of how folks in the industry have tried to leverage um, strategies to really take users through that flow. And hopefully some of these examples and some of these strategies are things that you can think through or apply within your own product. So this one's a little bit of a shameless plug. It's not e-commerce, but I'm obviously very familiar with this. So this was the app that I was talking about earlier that we had. And why I talk about setup is for any app, especially something this complex where you've got users interacting with multiple components. So the way this worked was, you could have calls or you could have music that you typically hear or messages coming back in and out, and you could basically do them one click or you can respond through voice, right? So both of those inputs basically reduce the amount of time you needed to do a certain action. So switching between apps, for example, or clicking through your music lists or responding to messages and so on. The big challenge, though, that we had was when you come in and you start engaging with the app, you don't want to start from scratch, and that's something that we saw with a lot of different applications, right? And so, how do you really get the user to be set up without actually any input? That was the objective. No input, and you're set up. It's a personalized product, um, for you right there. And that's something that if you were to look at an objective for a user coming to your product, that should be the objective. And if you start with that objective, then you can step backwards and try and figure out how that works. What was done here was leveraging. When it's a new user, unfortunately, you don't have much data because the user hasn't leveraged your platform at all. So you really don't know much about them. But in this scenario, we basically we went in and looked at usage frequency within the individual apps that they had used before, right? So we asked for permission, we leveraged APIs associated with the app, and we basically brought all of that together into the single pane class, right? And when you leverage that usage frequency for each category, and you start leveraging the usage patterns within those categories, right, you could start seeing how personal the app started becoming. And when you did that, you have moved both the parameters that we talked about earlier. The customer familiarity has gone up and the product complexity has come down. Now, it's not come down as much as you would like, but you've started at a point where you're not on the third quadrant that I showed you earlier in that. Right? And so now, over time, when I start learning usage behavior, then a more supervised model makes sense, right? It's more personal. As you keep going step by step through that journey, you're now optimizing for that individual user, right? And so that's kind of where I think from a product standpoint, when you're thinking a setup, you really want to, right? As opposed to some of the other ones where you're really going through a journey and then you get stuck at setup or sign up, right? Where a lot of information, manual information needs to be given to you, and that creates a whole lot of friction, right? So this is where you really want to think with. So now switching back to more familiar to a little less familiar ground. So setup on the e-commerce side, I know I talked about sign up, but there's a lot happening on your product, on the e-commerce product before setup or sign up really happens, right? And the one part that you have is basically, again, what we did with the app earlier, understanding the user, understanding their usage behavior, understanding what their favorite activities are or what their associations are outside of your product, because they're really not signed up, so you don't have any data about them, right? And so these are a few examples that I picked up, right? Um, at a broad level. So the first one, right, in the left is, excuse me, on the left is basically a company called Alloy Culture, right? And this company is very specific, catering to folks who are really tall, right? So it's kind of big and tall. People. And what they've done, interestingly, is leveraged, they found that location and browsing history for the cohort, not the individual user, but for the cohort that you've got from a setup standpoint is extremely powerful, right, for them. So if, for example, it's pants in that category available in California, they have started at that point. So they have realized that within that particular region or that particular location, if you bring some of this content together, then it's easy for users to recognize items quicker and basically signed up, right? The second one, this is example actually on eBay, where we had started actually asking users for their interests, right? So this is a little more explicit from a user input standpoint. But if you think about it, once you've committed yourself to some of these activities, right? Like what are your favorite activities, typically buy on the e-commerce space, in the e-commerce space, when you start putting that, it's a little more personal. It's not as dry and cut as, hey, sign up, give me your email, create a password, right? You have gotten to a point where you know your customer even before they've started shopping. And it's very lightweight, but it gives you the opportunity when you're entering into that flow that the user is now in with a little less product complexity, right? Where they're trying to find things that they want to find. Now you've got recommendations that are smarter, and your setup components can become a little easier, right? What this also lets you do is start kind of collating the cohort again, right? So if your user persona is comparable to somebody else, right? And you could go back, for example, to the location component, right? And you say, hey, in San Jose, I've got a lot of folks who are very active, right? So they love snowboarding, they love yoga and surfing. You could potentially start at that point in time and put that further up on the list. So the input that you need is really small. And your models then can become supervised. And once they become supervised, saying, hey, these are some things that typically people in San Jose and in California love, then you've really got a model that's effective. And then finally, if you were to go back, you're not done yet, right? It's not just about getting to a point where you've signed up or set up. It's also about conducting an activity um, that kind of creates a little bit of stickiness. So creating a sign up alone is not, you don't know anything about that user, right? So in the right-hand side scenario, for example, could leverage models where you're prompting the user once they've gotten a little bit further down in the funnel, because not everybody signs up on an e-commerce site, especially when they first land up. You could potentially help them understand and nurture them, saying, hey, this is a lightweight action that you could potentially take in this scenario, say, for example, saving your watch list, right? And your drivers could still be in browsing history, right? So your personal behavior, for example, you're looking more and more at, say, white zebra prints or affinity to the item. You keep coming back to the same item over and over again. Or the popularity of that item, for example, and we talk about retargeting later, could all be triggers that you could leverage to basically the user through a very valuable action. Right? and make it easy for your setup to be extensive and very dry that you really can't retarget the user. The second is the core, the wow moment that we talked about, right? So we kind of mixed the signed up and the setup moment a little bit in the previous section. So you have to excuse me a little bit there. But this is really where customer intent meets your product objective. Making the purchase is the fundamental requirement for your product, right? Fundamentally, an e-commerce player does not like, you can't stop at watch lists or other these kinds of components, right? You have to let the user make a purchase. And at this point in time, you want to start leveraging two components of the spectrum, right? You want to start leveraging one, your product differentiation, right? And it could be internal. So, for example, you think that within your product hierarchy, shipping is the most important thing to consider in, say, a certain category. For example, peripherals, electronics peripheral, uh, peripherals, um, as opposed to, say, for example, pricing, which is important in clothing, right? As opposed to external, where you're saying, hey, I, as a product, am more competitive in a particular segment, say, for example, price competitiveness. And that's more important for my product. And then including that again with the understanding of the customer. So hopefully at this point in time, you have some information about the customer. He's viewed a few items, he's saved a few items, he's potentially part of a group recognized effectively, right? And so now you know a little bit about the customer. And the intersection is where you really want to go, right? And I'll give you an example. This is again a major retailer in the US, right? And the challenge they had was they had become, over time, had become extremely complex as a product. So to drive wow moments, they really needed to improve conversion. They wanted to improve engagement. And so what they did is using a combination of both dynamic signals. So, for example, the popularity of the item, the engagement with the item. Say, for example, people watch it a lot more, or they add to cart heavily, or there have been a lot of different purchases over time for this particular product, included basically with static signals. So these could be shipping quality, where the item is located, the return policy associated with it, how effective the seller was. Combining both of these signals, you could potentially create a simple layout here. It's just super simple. You're giving him only two signals. You're giving the user only two signals, right? And you want to prioritize based on conversion in this scenario, what the user potentially might want, right? Or might want to know. So you've created this super simple product out here, which is completely removed the complexity of shipping, of payments, of delivery, of seller quality, of product quality, of price points, and basically just condensed it into just a couple of things. So the user comes in and just looks at these two, and over time recognizes, hey, if I want to buy this item, what is really the qualities that differentiate this with everything else, right? And interestingly, this actually drove over 4% improvement in engagement and conversion on this product alone. On this purchase page alone, they drove over 4% improvement just by doing this very simple thing. And that's what you really want to think about in this scenario. This is where your core really hits, and this is what you really want to think about as you move forward. One thing I want to talk about on the core is that you want to really think about it from a post-transaction standpoint as well. I'm not talking about it in too much. I want to think about post-transaction. And that is, nowadays, your transaction over is physically holding, say, for example, this laptop in his hand and using it and realize he's got is a great experience. So something to think about when you're considering this. I think The next part that we talked about was really creating a habit, right? So identifying, so there are basically two parts to the habit. And why habit's important is you don't want one and done customers. Because with one and done customers, all the other components I talked about before have basically fallen through the cracks. You know little about the customer, you know little about what his interests and ideas are, and you've potentially lost him to a competitor already. And that you want, is capturing customers is the hardest thing that you really want to do. So what are really the two things that you want to think about in this setup? Interestingly, the first one is to identify the habit moment associated with your product. So what this means is, at what point in time is the user truly familiar with your product, right? So he knows the in and out of the product. He knows how it works. And he has formed a habit of coming back to your product and using and leveraging it in a way that you think is consistent with what your original objective is. The second part of that equation is really identifying the next best action, right? So if you were to think about, gaming, for example, right? And that's gamification is a great example of how to create a habit, right? And good games really create habits by making sure that you don't just know where your tipping point is, where you're going to come back to the game again, but also identifying that next best action that you need to take, right? So common user groups are a great strategy to identify what the next best action is and then firing that next best action. So and that's basically what builds user familiarity. So just to give you guys an example, retargeting is basically what I'm talking about, right? And retargeting, for the most part, really happens offline, unfortunately, in e-commerce. So one of the big pushes that we're trying to make here is, how do we grab attention and retarget the user to buy more, to understand our value proposition, and do that in as simple a way as possible. So I've broken this down into two components. There are multiple others that you could use, right? And it kind of depends on the product and how you want to leverage it. But for example, grabbing attention in session retargeting really helps you, for example, increase order value. Or so for example, free shipping is a huge deal. I keep using shipping as an example, but it's a huge deal nowadays, right? You want free shipping, but you obviously want the user to buy more, right? And this may be one component important to one user, as opposed to somebody else, say, for example, a brand new user who's really interested in the personalized coupon. So the one at the top, a little blurry, but which says 10% off your first order, is a lot more attention grabbing and easier retargeting to say, hey, buy this. And potentially then you might come back and potentially create another account. Netflix does a great job of that. Just create another account, grab the 10%, try and use it. But it's a great way for users to come back. And similarly, on the left-hand side, that coupon is an exit intent model. So now what you've realized is, hey, I've got a situation where users are leaving me, and how do I kind of keep them back? And so another strategy that a lot of e-commerce players employ and is great for building models against is making sure you don't have users leaving. The second side that I'm taking is engaging content. Now, engaging content could be multiple various forms, right? And I'm just taking two, but again, like I said before, you could have like user-generated content, you could have reviews from third parties, so all kinds of things that really build on top of what you already have, right? So there are two examples that I've taken here. The first one is social retargeting. So for example, maxi dresses became a big deal when Meghan Markle basically came out, moved to the United States with Prince Harry, and you started seeing this retargeting being extremely effective. And users went back to sites where they believe that social retargeting or these kind of items are available. even though they may be available elsewhere, this is where you ended up, right? And if you did a decent job of search engine optimization, you basically get this user back. And if he's bought from you again before and had a positive experience, like we talked about the wow moment, then you really got a user who's formed a habit. He's going to come back to you the next time there's a social event, right? Or the next time, I don't know, the designs on a certain pattern change, for example, and they think, hey, you're the guy who's really going to leverage this, or you're the guy who's probably going to have this product with you, right? Another which is extremely popular is complementary retargeting. So I won't talk about this too much. These are old Nintendo gaming retargeting from a complementary standpoint, where but a lot of people use that. So I'm going to leave that alone. But I'm hoping that you got an idea of how some of your models um, would have external inputs and still be formed associated with engaging content. So that's basically the third part of your of creating a habit. Right? But the final part is the most important one. One and done, again, like I said before, is your biggest enemy. You as a product may have some amount of stickiness, but you need to start letting users maintain habits. So, as an example, again, like I said, from a habit moment standpoint, there are certain fundamental frequencies. Um, so, one is called a natural frequency. And a natural frequency is, say, for example, um, if you're buying a house, the natural frequency typically is, say, 3 years, 3 to 5 years, right? You're not going to buy a house every year. As opposed to, say, for example, a television or electronics that potentially has the shelf life of maybe a year and a half, because you've got a brand new version out there, and so you maybe want to upgrade to it. Right? Those are natural frequencies. The others are basically more nurture frequencies, where you're trying to get the user to do something additional over and above the natural frequency. So, as an example, buying a house, you potentially might be looking at renting a house, right? Potentially, or adding, maybe there's another natural frequency of adding furniture to your house, which is an effective way to really get or maintain a habit, assuming obviously that you want to sell furniture. It's not necessarily true. So the objective in this scenario is to find an appropriate timing when you're maintaining the habit with the user, right? And so again, the objective is to have the user visit again and purchase again. So um, on top of basically capture 4 inputs, but again, it kind of depends on your transaction. This is just one. Say, for example, if the user bought an item or abandoned a cart, then your input categories would be, hey, I know where he wants to buy and what category he wants to buy. And maybe he's got pending purchases. So how often within that cohort, say, for example, a new cohort that's just signed up, how many times are you effective if you retarget in a day or 2 days or 3 days? And this is where really models are extremely helpful. You can optimize user category or user or a cohort persona and really target at the right time and the right place, and you don't become spam. Right. The second one, for example, is item delivered, right? In which case you could have a positive experience and negative experience. And then again, in those cases, you probably want to follow up as soon as the delivery has happened and a review is left. So if you want to find out the experience, you follow up as soon as the delivery is made and you know when it's made. And then you follow up maybe if you've got a positive review past that point. Hopefully you have. In that scenario, you're basically looking at, hey, if you've got a positive review, you've created a habit, what next? Right? As opposed to a negative scenario where a negative feedback was left and you want to be immediate in your response, where you pick up the phone and call the guy saying, hey, what went wrong? So there are other examples. We'll share this, but feel free to expand on this. But a definite case in point is one major retailer that I'm aware of increased email CTRs by over 5% by adapting to natural frequencies, as opposed to more static frequencies where you will become more and more spam. And I'll just end this with one other example. So this one, for example, is Ergo Pouch, right? So Ergo Pouch is catered to babies, as you can see. Um, cute babies getting foods that are easy to swaddle in. And so, as I had mentioned before, you've got two components here. One is the cohort behavior that I talked about, right? Identifying where you had the most success, intimating the user. So early on, you probably play around with it and say, hey, it's a month if the baby if the baby was, say, for example, 3 months old. A month is more than time, and that's probably the right time to make the user saying, hey, guess what? I hope you're enjoying your pouch. I hope you had a good time. I hope you enjoyed the product and you're really enjoying the value. And that's a great point for you to kind of tap on that shoulder. The second part of that equation, but is personalizing it. So coming back and saying, hey, I hope you're enjoying it is not good enough. Because you are familiar with the customer and the customer is being familiar with you, but it's not personal. And in which scenario you again go back to your cohort and re-leverage that and try and see if for example, a pouch for a month-old baby, maybe the swaddlers and sleeping bags may make more sense. Or say, for example, if this was a Best Buy example, you've got accessories that would come, or upgrades that, accessories that come in immediately and upgrades that come in later, right? And so, as you can see, you're starting to create habit with the user by retargeting them. And overall, if I were to think about it in a nutshell, if you effectively leverage your user cohorts, create familiarity with your product, and simplify, even though you build complexity as you build more features, if you simplify them into a user journey that's super simple, extremely personal, and cuts across each of these individual timeframes, I believe that you will have success in your product. You will leverage both supervised and unsupervised models effectively, and you'll end up spending engineering time effectively, right? Which is super important because you don't want to build these models over time. They take time to learn. You don't want to build them and then realize that both the input metric that you were recognizing or the output metric you were recognizing, both of these are not moving in the right direction. Right? So I think that's basically, in a nutshell, how I see um, models evolving, being leveraged in the e-commerce space, helping you move your users from one cohort to the other, measuring how quickly they move, how much they retain with you, how much they engage with you, and hopefully these strategies that I've shared with you help you move forward, both within creating great products and really enjoying product management, because that's what it's all about, as well as kind of growing your career and really showing everybody that you're thinking about this end-to-end mode of it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you got what you wanted out of it. Um, Again, please feel free to kind of reach out and reach out to Product School. They're a great resource to find out more about how these things might help you and go deeper into it. And I wish you best of luck. Thank you.